Welcome to my lecture entitled Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Plot to Assassinate Hitler in Light of a Christian Worldview. My name is Ron Eckelbarger, and this is a sample lecture that would be a part of an online 300 level undergraduate college class on World War II. From here on out, this presentation will be as if it were an actual online lecture. Greetings, scholars. Today's presentation deals with the story of an individual who was caught up in the events of World War II and fought the evil of Hitler and the Nazis as best he could according to the dictates of his conscience. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was born in 1906 in the city of Breslau, which used to be in Germany but is now part of Poland. Dietrich grew up in Berlin in an intellectual middle-class family. His father, Karl Bonhoeffer, was a well-known and respected neurologist, psychiatrist, and physician. His mother, Paula von Hasse, was a teacher and the granddaughter of Protestant theologian Karl von Hasse and painter Stanislaus von Kalkreuth. His brother, Karl, was a famous chemist, and his other brother, Klaus, was a lawyer who ended up working in the resistance against Hitler. His sister, Christo, married Hans von Donani, who worked in the German Ministry of Justice. So he came from a very distinguished family. They were not terribly religious, however, and it surprised them a little when at the age of 14, Dietrich said that he wanted to be a Lutheran pastor. But it wasn't too out of line since his great-grandfather had been one. To give you an idea of Bonhoeffer's intellect, at the age of 21, he earned his Doctor of Theology from Humboldt University of Berlin, graduating summa cum laude. In 1930, he sailed to America to study for a year at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. While there, he became good friends with an African-American student, Albert Franklin Fisher. Frank, as he was called, attended the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. He invited Dietrich to attend with him. The young German scholar loved it. Here, for the first time, he experienced enthusiastic worship and fiery preaching. He observed, quote, "Here one can truly speak and hear about sin and grace and the love of God. Christ is preached with rapturous passion and vision," unquote. He became quite involved with the church and even taught a boys' Sunday school class. Later, Bonhoeffer described his time in America as the point at which he, quote, "turned from phraseology to reality," unquote. Another way to put that would be to say that he went from just knowing and talking about God to really experiencing and living in a relationship with God. He began to walk the talk, not merely talk it. I think that this is an important thing for us all to consider, regardless of whether we are Christians or not. Do we live what we claim to believe? Hitler was installed as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. He was democratically elected. Not that that excuses anything, but it is an interesting irony. 2 days later, Bonhoeffer, at that time a young theologian of only 26, delivered a radio address entitled "The Younger Generation's Altered Concept of Leadership." It dealt with the fundamental problems of leadership by a Führer, which is the German word for leader. Inevitably, Bonhoeffer explained, the leader becomes an idol and a misleader. Now, the radio speech and topic had been scheduled months before Hitler had been elected. Nevertheless, before Dietrich Bonhoeffer could finish his radio address, the speech was cut off. From the very beginning, Bonhoeffer did all he could to oppose Hitler and the Nazis. When Hitler began to Nazify the Lutheran Church in Germany by having one of his cronies elected as its head, and when a rule was made called the Arian Paragraph, which canceled the ordination of clergy of Jewish descent and even clergy married to non-Aryans, Bonhoeffer joined with theologian Karl Barth and others to draft the Barmen Declaration of Faith and begin what was called the Confessing Church. This declaration and confession was basically that the church and the followers of Christ answered to God and God alone, and that Jesus was their Lord and the sole source of truth. From 1935 to 1937, Bonhoeffer ran an underground seminary in Finkenwalde to train pastors for the Confessing Church until the Gestapo shut it down. In 1939, it was obvious that things were going to get really bad really fast in Germany, as if things already hadn't. Dietrich was offered a position to teach at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He accepted it and went to New York, but after only 26 days there, he realized that God wanted him in Germany. In a letter, he wrote the following, quote, "I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but cannot make that choice from security," unquote. He returned to Germany on the very last ship that sailed from the United States to Germany before the beginning of World War II. In spite of the fact that the Nazi Party considered him an enemy of the state, his brother-in-law, Hans Donani, gave him a job with the Abwehr, a German military intelligence organization. Now, a helpful way to think about this is that the Abwehr was like the CIA and the Gestapo was like the FBI. There was a great rivalry between the Gestapo and the Abwehr, and the Gestapo kept investigating Bonhoeffer because they did not trust him at all. Meanwhile, he really was working as a double agent. He traveled to Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, gave vital information to the Allies, and helped smuggle Jews to freedom, all under the cover of being an Abwehr agent who supposedly was gaining intel for the Third Reich. It was during this time that Bonhoeffer became involved with a conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. There were a number of generals and high-ranking members of the Abwehr who were actively planning to eliminate Hitler and restore a democratic government to Germany, end the war, and stop the genocide against the Jews. Hans Donani, Dietrich's brother Klaus, and Dietrich himself were key players in the conspiracy. Now here we have a significant moral dilemma. As a Christian, or even just as a human being, is it wrong to assassinate an obviously evil dictator like Adolf Hitler who was killing millions of people? Bonhoeffer did not attempt to justify his action in any way, but he accepted that he was taking guilt upon himself. He wrote this, quote, "When a man takes guilt upon himself in responsibility, he imputes his guilt to himself and no one else. He answers for it. Before other men, he is justified by dire necessity. Before himself, he is acquitted by his conscience. But before God, he hopes only for grace," unquote. Bonhoeffer was also known to have made statements like the following, quote, "It is not only my task to look after the victims of madmen who drive a motor car in a crowded street, but to do all in my power to stop their driving at all," unquote. Because of certain financial irregularities in the Abwehr, which were caused by the smuggling of Jews into Switzerland, Bonhoeffer and others were arrested by the Gestapo on April 5th, 1943. For a year and a half, Bonhoeffer was imprisoned at the Tegel prison, awaiting trial. There, he continued his work in religious outreach among his fellow prisoners and guards. Some guards who were sympathetic to his plight helped him smuggle letters out of prison to Eberhard Bethge and others. These uncensored letters were posthumously published in a book entitled Letters and Papers from Prison. July 20th, 1944 was the day that Operation Valkyrie failed. The plot to assassinate Hitler was made well known in a 2008 movie starring Tom Cruise. The whole plan was to have a bomb in a suitcase at a meeting that Hitler was attending. The bomb did go off, but somehow Hitler survived. At this point, the entire conspiracy and all its members were completely exposed, including Dietrich, Klaus, and Hans. Eventually, Bonhoeffer was transferred from Tegel to Buchenwald concentration camp, and from there to the extermination camp at Flossenburg. On April 9th, 1945, 1 month before Germany surrendered, he was stripped of his clothing and hanged with 6 other resistors. A prisoner that he passed on his way to the gallows remarked that Bonhoeffer said to him, quote, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." A decade later, a camp doctor who witnessed Bonhoeffer's hanging described the scene, quote, "The prisoners were taken from their cells and the verdicts of court-martial read out to them. Through the half-open door in one room of the huts, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer, before taking off his prison garb, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a prayer and climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued in a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I have worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." Unquote. There is so much to Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life and writings that I have not been able to cover in this lecture. I would encourage you to read the book that he wrote in 1937 entitled The Cost of Discipleship. A good biography is one by Eric Metaxas entitled Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. In closing, I want us to consider a few things. Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not have the luxury of living out his life in peace and comfort, with the greatest moral dilemma being whether or not to cheat on his taxes. For him, he was forced to decide if what he said he believed became what he lived, or if it would remain just talk. So here's the first question I ask. What would you do in Bonhoeffer's position? He had several major decisions in his life, and all of them changed where he ended up. Would you have stayed in America in 1939, or would you have returned to Germany to live under Hitler, knowing that the regime already viewed you as an enemy? Why do you think he decided as he did? Was his decision to return to Germany in line with his Christian worldview? A second major decision was to get involved as a double agent and to help Jews escape from Germany. Would you take a chance and disobey your national government if it meant saving someone else's life? How does this act mesh with a Christian worldview? What worldview or value system would allow or even promote such an act? His final major decision was to get involved in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Is that consistent with a Christian worldview? Should a Christian do something like that? Why or why not? What about other worldviews? What about you? Could you do what Bonhoeffer did? We may or may not ever be called upon to make the life and death decisions that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to make. But we all make choices every day. And those choices reflect what we really believe, not just what we say we believe.